Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Horror at the Hospital, Volume 2, Story 1. I was a cook in a care home, not exactly a healthcare professional, but once in our building we had a convicted child molester/rapist. Real creep. Nurses didn't spend any more time in there than they needed. I don't know why he was in there, but he was on his way out when we got him. Never had any family visit him. I guess when he started getting his foot in the grave, he started screaming about black hooded people coming to take him away. He'd yell about how there was a portal to hell in his room and that they were going to take him there. I think this lasted about a week before he kicked the bucket. I'm not a spiritual guy, but I do think there was some cosmic justice dished out here. He died the way he deserved to die. Cold, alone, and horrified. Story number 2. I worked in a SNF for a little over 2 years as an LVN. Some strange things that were too odd to just be coincidence were that the residents that were close to passing or not in good shape or recovery would always, and I mean always, would complain about children in their room making too much noise. As soon as a patient started complaining of that, it was always expected with us nurses, keep a close eye on them because, like clockwork, a few days later, or even a couple of weeks, those patients would pass. There were instances where some CNA would see children in the facility late night. Next morning, a resident expired. It's very crazy. Another instance, I had to write up a change of condition because late at night, a patient who was usually alert and oriented became extremely hysterical. I asked the patient what was wrong, and she said there was an older woman crawling on the floor towards her bed. Because this is an unlikely occurrence, we had to let the doctor know that the resident might need some tests done, such as a UA, to rule out UTIs and other infections that can cause confusion. It was eerie. Charting resident states woman crawling on the floor towards her. Next story. I'm an EMT, and I once showed up to a call for a lady that had just had eye surgery, and she had to go to the hospital because her medication wasn't sitting right or something along those lines. I believe the call line was lightheaded. Going down the street to her house, it was something straight out of a horror movie. Street light flickering, and of course she lives at the dilapidated house at the end of the street with overhanging willow trees and such. Very creepy. So we show up, go inside, police are already there. There was a police officer talking to her husband in the kitchen, and she was sitting down in the living room. She was completely mentally fine. Me, basically being on my training wheels, EMT-wise, they told me just to go over and take her pulse and BP while they talked to the husband to gain some background info. So after I took her pulse and BP, which takes all of about 2 minutes, I was just talking to her, waiting for the senior members to come into the room. She asked me what I wanted to do, what I was going to school for, volunteer EMS, so that's not my job. So I told her, and we had a nice conversation about pharmaceuticals because she was a pharmacist. Then all of a sudden, she looks over my shoulder, turns completely white. So, me being the smart EMT I was trying to be, I quickly grabbed her arm to check her pulse. To make sure she still had a good one. She was cold as a rock, but she still had a pulse. Come to think of it, the room was actually freezing at this point. Then she just starts screaming. Not some just half-assed screaming. She was full-on scared for her life screaming. "They're here to kill me! They're here to kill me!" I turned around to look at what she was looking at, and the senior EMTs and the police officers came running, and I'm looking behind me just like, what the F do I do? I was totally creeped out. Let me tell you, we pieced the F out of there pretty quickly. Next story. I'm an RN, and I've had my share of odd happenings. One of the creepiest took place on the night shift at a hospital in Texas. I was caring for a man who was dying from liver failure. He was fairly young, and his mother and girlfriend had been staying at his bedside for days. He was nearing death and had been unresponsive for days. Late one night, I realized he was going to die shortly and woke his mom and girlfriend so they could say their goodbyes. His girlfriend sat next to his bed to hold his hand. Suddenly, the man, who had been completely unresponsive for days, sits upright in bed with the most terrified expression I've ever seen. His eyes were huge and terror-filled. His mouth was curled into what I can only describe as silent shrieking, and he was staring up at a ceiling corner. His girlfriend, of course, was thrilled, thinking that he was suddenly okay. She put her hand on his head and tried to turn his head towards her so he could see her. She's telling him she loves him and to look at her, but he just continued to have the most bone-chilling look of pure fear on his face. When she managed to turn his head, his eyes continued to focus on the same spot on the ceiling. So there she is, holding his face towards her, shrieking at him to look, and at her, but he won't take his eyes off the same spot on the ceiling in the corner. And then he just simply fell back and died. It was awful. Next story. When my grandma was in assisted living for a short time, one of the nurses told me this story. They had a lady who had mental retardation. She would get up, make a mess, talk loudly, and normally hated being in bed. One day the nurse walked in to find a guy in his 40s or so, sitting there while she slept during the day. She asked him, and he said something like, "I'm just making sure she makes it okay." Nurse went on about her business, and later that night the lady died. She had no family, so they cleaned her room. The first nurse was looking through a photo album and found a picture of the guy with a lady. Second nurse saw the picture and mentioned, "Oh, that was her father. He brought her here before he died of cancer about 10 years ago." Don't know what to say, but that is what she told us. Next story. Private duty home health nurse here. I worked third shift in a patient's house. The patient lived in a very old house with her parents. I often saw flashes of light in the hallway between 2 to 4 a.m. Sometimes I would see a figure move by the open door. Everyone else saw it as well. The creepiest thing had to do when I heard the dad scream at around 2 p.m. Middle of the day. He was in bed with the windows covered so his room was dark. He claimed he felt someone sit on his bed. He assumed it was one of his kids, so he told the person to get out so he could sleep. The bed kept moving, so he sat up to see which kid it was. He said he saw a small pale kid with black hair and black eyes staring at him. He screamed and tried pushing the thing away, but his hands went through it. That's when he ran out of the room screaming. Pretty creepy. Next story. There was a psych facility I was working at. It was the knock shift, and there was slamming doors and tapping on the floor above by a broom handle or something like a stick. I kept thinking that the locked unit above must be the most intense and never have a dull moment. Then at 3 or 4 a.m. one morning, doors kept slamming, and I told one of the doctors, "I'm going to go up there and see what all the commotion is about, because it's waking patients up on my floor." His reply startled me quite a bit. The doctor told me, "What floor above us? We are on the 4th floor. There is no other floor above us." I was shocked, and he said he had reported the noises, as had others, to the maintenance, but they said that there's nothing on the roof that would make those noises. And of course, I don't work there anymore. Next story. When I first started out as a CNA, I worked for a nursing home on the very outer rim of the Minneapolis-St. Paul suburbs. This nursing home was rumored to have a resident ghost known as the Pink Lady. Her actual name escapes me at the moment. She was a resident that had passed some 10 or 15 years before I began working there. I almost exclusively worked the evening shift, but I did pick up nights from time to time. This particular night, I was working the east side of the building. I was doing my rounds, and as I came out of a room, I saw at the end of the hall, in the lounge area, a woman in a pink robe. None of the residents on that wing were as ambulatory as this woman was, especially with no assistance. As I made my way to her, because patient safety, she made her way to a room. I followed after her, and she had simply vanished. The resident in the room was fast asleep and male. I asked one of the nurses about it, and they told me the story. Apparently the pink lady, when she was alive, was physically healthy, but had some major cognitive issues and wouldn't sleep at night. She spent the nights pacing up and down the hall in her pink robe. This place was also known to have disembodied voices in the supply closets when the doors were shut and something in the basement. I never did follow up on that one. Next story. My mom had been a nurse for decades. She told me that once another nurse she worked with called Sarah was on night duty in the nursing home they worked at when an old woman in bed began making a disturbance at 3 a.m. Sarah went up to attend to her, and the old woman, Doreen, was saying, "My sister just came. She told me not to worry and she is in the right place." The room was freezing, but Sarah thought the old woman had just been dreaming. Still, she wrote everything down in the night report. The next day, Doreen's brother came to the nursing home and said that Doreen's younger sister had died at 3 a.m., the exact time that Doreen had seen her. A nurse my mom used to work with had been one of the first nurses into Bergen-Belsen to treat the inmates after the camp was liberated. She had given medical treatment to the children there. Years later, when the old woman was dying, for 3 days she kept looking around her bed and saying, the children are here." My parents used to own a nursing home, and when it closed down and was empty, my dad spent a few nights sleeping there to deter squatters. One of the patients who had died earlier had been an old woman called Doris, who had always been calling out "nurse" in a really deep, manly voice. While my dad was staying alone in the empty nursing home, he kept hearing this woman who had died calling "nurse" in her deep, manly voice. My mom was going off duty from a surgical ward at about 9 p.m. one night when a patient asked for a bedpan. My mom walked out to fetch one when she saw an old woman walking along the ward towards her. The old woman had on an old-fashioned black coat, a hat, and a walking stick. In the other hand, she was using a bed for support. My mom thought she'd come to visit. My mom turned for a second to pull a curtain around a bed, and she turned back, and the old-fashioned woman had disappeared. And there was nowhere she could have gone. Next story. I was a patient in the hospital when this happened, so not quite a hospital worker, but I think it's still relevant. I'd like to start out by saying I was not on any mind-altering drugs, and I've never had any mental health problems either. I was in the hospital for about 5 nights in the older wing of the hospital. At night, I would always leave the bathroom light on so it wasn't pitch black, and I could get to the bathroom if I needed it. Around night 3, I woke up and noticed somebody standing next to me between me and my IV machine. At first, I thought they were just taking readings from my machine, so I closed my eyes for a second to let them do their thing. I opened my eyes a couple of seconds later and nobody was standing there. There were no footsteps or doors closing that you would have heard with a nurse. It wasn't until later that I realized there aren't even any readings to be taken from an IV machine. It was simply just on or off. I didn't really think much about it then. Around night 4 or 5, I woke up again. On the right side of the room was a coat hanger, and if you didn't know any better, you might think the shadow from the coat hanger was a person's shadow. I'd been here long enough at this point where I was used to that shadow. However, on this night, there was another shadow on the left side of the room. As I'm looking at it, wondering what is causing this new shadow, I slowly start to realize that looks like a person's shadow. Right about the same time I'm realizing this, its left arm raises straight out like at a 90-degree angle and points towards the door, essentially telling me to get out. I closed my eyes, jerked my head to the right, and mentally screamed, "Nope!" I opened my eyes a second later and there was nothing there. No shadowy person or anything. I only got a quick glimpse of whatever the thing was, but I could kind of tell by the outline that it was shorter, wore a gown, and had a grandma-style haircut. It was also a little different than just a regular shadow. It's like it wasn't actually against the wall and was a 3-dimensional object standing in the room. After seeing it the second time, I realized it was the same thing I saw a couple of nights ago. It actually wasn't all that scary. It was more like I've never seen anything like that before. And in a way, I'm glad I never saw another one since then. Next story. I used to work as a CNA in an assisted living facility. First year working with a patient privately, and there were no issues. Nothing weird happened at all. Then I got asked to work overnights, and at first, it's still all good. I tried to nap throughout the night as much as I could, but a couple of months in, I kept waking up in the middle of my naps, like being startled into wakefulness. Then I started to wake up to a feel like someone whispering my name in my ear. Okay, creepy, but maybe it's a dream, I'm thinking. Then a week later, I woke up to something just completely neutral, like not exactly male or female, just a voice violently shouting my name, like it echoed across the room when I was fully awakened. Maybe it's still the dream, I didn't know. I tried my best to rationalize. Right after this, my patient started seeing things, of course, talking to people that weren't there, accusing me of drugging her, seeing strange men in the windows and people hiding in her closet. I suspected she had a UTI, but apparently she actually had pneumonia and was hospitalized for a few days. The worst thing, though, after all this happened, every day at 5:45 p.m., my patient scooted on down to the dining hall for dinner, and I took an hour's break. So one day, in mid-January last year, I wanted to take a shower because I did a lot of cleaning that day and just felt a bit grimy. I took a long steamy shower that fogged up the windows. I exited the bathroom, dressed and dried, and for some reason the first thing my eyes get drawn to is the window near my patient's bed. There's a handprint in the upper right corner, clearly outlined. Not only had the door to the suite been locked, but my patient is incredibly short and immobile without her scooter, due to paralyzation because of polio. Not to mention she has 5 fingers, handprint only had 4. Unadulterated, absolute anxiety set in when you are faced with physical truth, and that handprint will forever haunt my memory. Taunting the logical, cynical side of me, I'm not a religious woman, but I've prayed the rosary at that moment if I could find the right beads. My patient moved and no longer sees people in her windows and closets. Turns out she doesn't have dementia either, after all. And I no longer get that terrifying, hair-raising feeling that something malicious is following me home from work at night. Tells you that there was something about that place. Next story. I'm a sterile processing tech at a fairly average-sized hospital, about 180 beds. I've been working here for 4 years, and I worked the graveyard for 8 months. My aunt used to work in transportation graveyard as well. One night I saw her in the basement. I thought it was her, so I tried to catch up. She must have been maybe 12 or 15 feet ahead of me. She kept on walking, only she sped up. I called her name, but she wouldn't turn and just kept walking on faster and faster. So I figured maybe she doesn't want to see me. She made a right turn onto another long hallway with only about 2 doors on the left side of it, other than that it was fairly empty. The hallway had no other place where she could have hidden. It connected the main hospital with a doctor's office building. I kept on following her because it honestly intrigued me as to why she was going that way, since this building is closed, and also because I wanted to know why she was acting so effing weird. When I turned, I thought she was gonna jump scare me or something, but she was gone. There was no one there. What boggled my freaking head was that I had just walked back to the cafeteria, and there she was, sitting. I just about pooped my pants because there was no way a lady in her 40s is gonna beat me through the only route from that point in the hospital to the cafeteria and be sitting there eating. I could have sworn it was her. Even if it wasn't my aunt, there was no one else that looks like her in the hospital, let alone another transport wearing the uniform, since she was the only woman of her department at 3 a.m. I still try to make sense of the whole thing, but I just can't figure it out. I chased what I thought was my aunt down a scary hallway at 3 a.m. and it turns out I was chasing an effing ghost, I think. Next story. A nurse friend of mine told me this. Years ago, she worked at one of those locked-down, expensive facilities for teens that had a patient, a 14-year-old girl, who became very agitated one day. It all came down very fast. 3 nurses were trying to restrain her. My friend says she had superhuman strength. A doctor, a big guy, came running in. As I said, everything happened so fast there was not even a chance to call the orderlies. He got her in a bear hug where they were facing each other. That's when it happened. The girl said in a totally exorcist guttural devil voice, "I bet you go home to your family and pray to God every night." Then she growled until they finally got her under control, but my friend said it was like two people growling were coming out of her mouth. My friend is religious, a Southern Baptist, as are most of the people where I live. She said she and the other people in the room all spoke of it later, and to a fault, each one of them got down on their knees and prayed that night. Really shook her up. It was years later when she told me, and she paled relating it. Next story. I was on break outside in a gazebo at a LTC facility with a CNA. The CNA pointed out a black cat on the roof of the facility and said, "Every time that cat shows up on the roof, someone whose bed is near the cat dies." Sure enough, later that shift, the lady whose room was under the cat did die. I told my teenage daughter about this, and it kind of gave her chills. We were looking out of our window, and our own black cat jumped on the pickup truck and from there up to our roof. That gave both of us chills. About 20 years ago, in a different LTC facility before I was a nurse, I was going to assist the night nurse with vital signs. I told her I saw something white floating down the hall. She said it may have been a resident walking. I said no, it was floating. About the area where I saw this, we had a linen cart covered with white, and I assumed maybe that is really what I had seen. The first room we went into, of course, was near the spot. As I was putting on the BP cuff on the resident, the nurse said, "Never mind." I didn't get it and continued to put on the cuff when the nurse said, "She's dead, and I believe you saw her soul leaving." Well, being easily spooked, that job didn't last much longer. Next story. A couple, retired military captain and his wife Margaret, sold their house to move to Florida. It so happens that they sold their house to the state. The state was going to use it as a resident home for mentally disabled teens. After the closing, but before they moved, Margaret died in the house. The captain had to move because the house was already sold. Do you know where I'm going with this? The residents always referred to her as an old lady when they saw her. The nursing staff just referred to her as Maggie. Now, late at night, when the residents were asleep, if the staff put the TV on more adult programming like Red Shoe Diaries, etc., the TV would turn off, and when turned back on, would come on to a different channel. There was this one nurse. It was like the house was out to get her. She'd swear that the carpet tripped me. When cupboard opened, knives would fall out aimed at her. Turns out this nurse was eventually fired for abusing and stealing from the residents. Maggie took care of her children. Next story. A friend of mine, who was also a nurse, used to work in a hospice. She told me about a patient that she cared for that was very mean. She was an individual who was hateful to her family as well as the nurses who cared for her. As this woman was dying, she became very afraid and started yelling that she was burning. She screamed and wailed about burning right up until she died. I used to work in an old hospital built in the 1930s. I worked on a med-surg unit. In room 7, the beds used to raise up and down by themselves. We called maintenance, who checked the beds out and said they were fine. While the beds were in the hall, they didn't move. Once they went back into room 7, they started moving again. Our old facility had closed down, and since then we've moved into a new hospital. There's some rumor that the land was once a cemetery. The night before we moved into the new hospital, the fire alarms went off, and it was discovered that the burners were turned on in the kitchen. No one had been in the kitchen that day. The first week of staying at the hospital, one patient said her window kept swinging open. The handle to open the window is difficult to turn, and the patient was unable to get out of bed. There's a pet cemetery nearby. Several patients have reported seeing cats and dogs in their rooms. Even my grandfather, who stayed there for a week, kept saying that there was a big yellow cat in the corner that stared at him. Next story. Every hospital I've worked in has at least one ghost. I've never worked in a nursing home, but I hear from a friend who has that they have their own ghost as well. Years ago, and this will age me, I worked at an old hospital in Utah. We just moved into a brand new tower, and the old hospital was scheduled for demolition. Several co-workers wanted to walk through the old unit one last time. As we walked past what had once been the large men's ward, we saw a couple of figures in what should have been a completely empty ward. One of my co-workers peeked in to investigate and immediately backed out, face as white as a blank order sheet. Of course, I was curious then, so I looked at myself. All I saw was two older men sitting on an old bed chatting. My co-worker explained that was Billy and Larry, or Mo and Joe, I've forgotten the names. They were frequent flyers in the ward. Both were royal pains in the patoot when they were alive, which they weren't anymore. She said they'd been rumored to still be hanging around, but no one had actually seen them before. Next story. This one is pretty creepy, and it is one of the reasons I got out of the hospital and started working office case management. I worked many years steadily on nights, and I was constantly overtired, never felt quite rested. While waiting for my husband to get home, he worked steady second shift, I worked steady nights. I was dozing on the couch, the kids were in bed. I was half in and out of consciousness when I felt a presence. Even though my eyes were closed tight, I felt the room turn red beyond my eyelids. I started to hear the whispers of 1,000 souls in the room. The air was oppressive, and I tried to scream, though no sound came out. The whispers got louder and louder, though I could not tell what the souls were trying to say. When my husband's key turned in the door, the redness in the room vanished. The whispers instantly stopped, and I became wide awake, as though never asleep. I told my husband I felt it would be a bad night. Sure enough, in the room across the hall from the nurse's station, you know, the one that is reserved for the sickest or the most unstable, so to be close when the code is called, my co-worker's patient strangled herself silently in her waist restraint. Her body was contorted, limbs contorted in unnatural ways, with her face smashed between the bed rail and the mattress. My co-worker was distraught, having checked on her only 20 minutes prior. We called the code and worked on her a back-breaking 30 minutes. I did compressions, and I still remembered the sound of a couple of ribs cracking. In the end, she was gone, and my co-worker was beside herself. The next night, the same scenario. I waited for my husband to come home. I drifted in and out of consciousness. The room turned red beyond my eyelids, and 1,000 souls whispered tortured sounds into my ears, but I wasn't able to discern what they were saying. I opened my mouth to scream. Nothing came out. I woke to the sound of the key in the door. That night, I had agreed to switch sides with my co-worker, having felt pity for her. The room across the hall was clean, and in it was a new patient, a man in his 50s with moving chest pain. I was tired from the night before, my back still sore from the 30 minutes of doing compressions. I worked swiftly as I could in getting in first rounds, checking frequently on my new friend across the hall with moving chest pain. I was newly trained in telemetry and felt concerned about the pain that moved across his chest and down the left arm, then back up and down the right arm. Although I was new, I felt that I noted a subtle ST depression on his rhythm strip, but a more seasoned telenurse looked at the strip and said it was nothing. I called a cardiologist, and though I didn't want to seem overly zealous, I told him about the moving chest pain and what I felt to be a subtle change in the ST segment. He ordered my patient my Elox and Tylenol, which I gave. Then I was sidetracked by a patient whose rate suddenly went into the 150s. I got busy with his orders, and for a moment forgot about my patient with the moving chest pain. Suddenly the unit clerk shouted at me in the still of the night down the hall, "Patty, go see your patient in 15. He's in VTAC." As I raced to his room, she said, "No, now he's in VFib." I yelled over my shoulder, "Call a code." As I ran to his room, the hues changed from a soft yellow to a definite red. I looked at my patient as he sat up and laid down, up and down, up and down, again and again, making these agonal sounds. He could not sit still. In the midst of this, the code team came in. They all watched as this man sat up and laid down again and again. In all, we watched as this man breathed his last earthly breath. As he laid down for the last time, they sprang into action, but too late. He died of a massive heart attack. A week later, I was applying to every insurance company in town. I got my steady daylight weekends and holidays off. I made sure I got 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep. I vowed never to work nights again. Next story. I used to work in an old Catholic hospital. Where the labor and delivery unit is located now, it used to be the convent for the nuns that worked at this hospital. One of the nuns died of natural causes years ago. This nun loved and raised numerous varieties of roses. Ever since the OB department was moved to this area, anytime a mother or baby is having difficulties, you can smell the scent of roses throughout the whole unit. The OB nurses know to be prepared when they start smelling the scent of roses. If a mother or baby dies, the room suddenly fills with rose petals. It's one of the creepiest, but also loving things that happen. I was standing in a room one night when the baby died. The room filled with white and pink rose petals. The nurses and family was creeped out. I worked at another hospital where you would see a nurse in the old white dress and cap walk down the hallway and smile at you. Then she would walk into a patient's room and apply wrist restraints. All the nurses knew her. It was just Mildred, who died 60 years ago. You just had to follow her so you could take the wrist restraints off. Next story. I was helping another nurse with a patient that had lived a very hard life. It had numerous things going on with him, from cardiac to renal failure. You name it, he had it going on. This man was very much afraid to die. Every time his heart monitor beeped, he would just go into a rage, screaming, "Don't let me die! Don't let me die!" The other nurse and I found out why he didn't want to die. About 0200, his cardiac monitors started alarming VTAC. We both rushed into the room. I pulled the crash cart behind me. When I got to the room, the other nurse was completely white. This man was sitting about 2 inches above the bed and was laughing. His whole look completely changed. His eyes just had a look of pure evil on them, and he had this evil smile on his face. He laughed at us and said, "You stupid bitches aren't going to let me die, will you?" And he laughed again. We were kind of frozen. I did reach up and hit the code blue button, and when I did, the man went into VFib. He crashed back into the bed. We started coding him, but after 20 minutes, it was called. 5 minutes after the code was called, several of the code team in the room were cleaning up, and this man sat straight up in the bed and said, "You let him die. Too bad," and then began laughing. The man collapsed back to the bed. We heard a horrible, agonizing scream. Actually, every patient in the unit that night commented on the scream. And then you could hear, "Don't let me die," being whispered throughout the unit. Every one of the nurses that night was pale and scared. Nobody went anywhere by themselves. By morning, the whispers of "don't let me die" were gone. The night shift nurses had a prayer service in the break room before we left for home, and then we all had nightmares for a week. Next story. I work in the MICU, and we get some really, really sick patients. I haven't actually seen any ghosts, but my unit has some ghost stories. For instance, in bed 3, there was a homeless patient named Willie, who thanks to modern medicine was kept alive for, I believe, around 3 months. No family to stop care. Willie eventually died, but patients who are in bed 3 will talk about their friend Willie, who brought them a blanket or stopped by to talk. Bed 3 is at the end of the unit and has an anteroom before you go in. You can see directly in bed 3 unless you're in the anteroom or looking at the room on the monitor. One night, with no patient in bed 3, the monitor flipped to the room and a body was seen laying over the side of the bed, over the side rails, kind of floating. The room was checked and no one was there. Another night, a nurse who worked in the unit a few years saw something or someone sitting in a chair behind the door in bed 3 with their legs crossed. She wondered, since we have limited visiting hours, how a family member got in the room. She went in the room and no one was there. Needless to say, she was freaked out. There was also another patient who was a young woman in her 20s who contracted necrotizing fasciitis from one of her kids who had strep. She was in the unit a while and eventually died. One of the nurses coming on to the next shift wanted to know why the patient was standing on the back side of the unit with her twin daughters holding their hands. Wondering how she made such a miraculous recovery, she was informed the patient had died earlier that day. Next story. The very small step-down unit I worked in was having nighttime staffing issues. I agreed to rotate to nights to help them out. It was a 4-bed, newly renovated unit. It was around 3 a.m. and I was watching the monitors, listening to the patients snore. The pencil drawer slid open. I didn't think much of it since the hospital was on a very busy avenue. I thought it was caused by the vibrations from the traffic on the busy road below. After sliding the drawer back several times, I decided the drawer felt it needed to be opened, so be it. Then several minutes later, I heard a noise in the room, the patient's bathroom door opening and the sound of someone pushing an IV pole. Since I did not have clear view of the bathroom, I just thought one of the staff members from the main floor had dashed in to wash their hands. I looked up from my monitor viewing to see a patient we recently had in the unit, Mrs. G, an older woman who came in with atypical chest pain, became septic due to a gallbladder issue. She evidently had expired in the unit. Although the hospital itself had been on this site for years, the unit was newly renovated right down to tearing down walls and putting up new ones. I heard the patient's bathroom door open, and again I heard the rattling of the IV pole and shuffling feet. I looked up and saw Mrs. G standing there in the middle of the floor, one hand pushing the IV pole, the other hand on top of the pump on the pole. She stopped walking, turned, waved, nodded her head, said everything was going to be okay, took a few steps and disappeared. It was quite a sight to see. Shortly after that vision, one of the nurses from the floor came in to see if I needed anything. I told her no, I was okay, and asked her if she had ever seen a ghost in the hospital. She looked at me aghast and said, "No, why?" I explained to her what had just happened. She said she would never step foot in that room again. Mrs. G was the first patient to die in that unit. She was well liked by all the staff, and my feeling was that she was watching over us. The day shift came in, and I told them my story. They weren't surprised. Through the years working at various hospitals, I worked as a nurse extern my senior year in nursing school and heard older nurses telling their stories about ghosts. I thought they were just burnt out. Right, there are ghosts in just about every care facility. If they're not seen, their presence is felt. They leave an energy behind. Next story. I was working my regular 7 to 7 night shift in a bone marrow transplant unit with one other nurse. We had 5 patients and it was about 3:30 a.m. My coworker had just come out of room 4 and I startled her as she came around the corner. Well, she had been emptying a urinal when the bathroom door had closed on her, which of course freaked her out and she spilled urine on herself, but I digress. She proceeded to tell me that there was a young gentleman who had been in that room who had died a rather gruesome death. Evidently, this man was slated to go home, but one night around 4, the nurse heard a thump, the sound of someone falling. They rushed in the room and this man was in the bathroom, central line out, and blood everywhere. They coded him, but he died right there in the bathroom. No one is sure why he pulled his line or what had happened, but evidently the scene was a bloodbath. Horrible, horrible. Now here comes the scary part. A few weeks later, a sweet little old lady is in that room and asked the nurse if someone had died in there. The nurse explained that this is a hospital and it was likely that someone could have died. Well, the lady says, "I think a young guy died in here." The nurse asked why. The lady responded, "Because he's talking to me." Oh, okay, I'm not making this up. This lady had a central line, triple lumen. The nurse goes in there and there is blood everywhere. One of her lines is cut, not pulled out, but cut. There are no scissors in the room. The lady says, "He did it." Oh my gosh, even the doctors were trying to get a priest or something to come in and say some prayers in that room. So one of my coworkers is telling me all this, and we were scaring each other when all of a sudden the call light goes off for that room. We looked at each other, and both of us went into the room because neither one of us was going to go in there alone. The patient was sleeping soundly. Luckily, her central line was fine. Next story. I worked at an independent living assisted facility for almost 4 years, and in almost every department save for nursing and housekeeping. Anyway, this past fall semester, I was working security. My general duties including answering phones, helping residents, making exterior rounds, shoveling snow. I swear we had one of the snowiest winters I can remember when I worked this position, and locking up the window at 2100 hours. On one such night, I just finished locking up the building. I let myself back into the office to record the temps from the coolers in the kitchen and such. As I'm writing, out of the corner of my eye, I see a man who I thought lived at the east end of the building. He doesn't move too quickly, but not overly slow. Needless to say, if I wanted to, I could have caught up with him going down either hall quite easily. As soon as I saw the man, I put down my pen and went right out into the hall. Nobody in the east end, nobody in the west end, nobody on the mezzanine. The only way he could have gotten away is if he ran. That's how quickly I dropped my pen and investigated. I was eagerly anticipating the night janitor clocking on. In another occurrence, I had finished up my rounds. I'd say it was about 21:45. I settled in with one of my textbooks at the front desk to study some material for my nursing theory lecture. I didn't see any movement out of the corner of my eyes, but I heard the distinct sound of one of those aluminum, I don't know what material, but the little silver ones going over tile. The only tile in the whole building is right in the front lobby and in the kitchen. Nobody was around. Again, I was eagerly anticipating the night janitor coming on so I could clock out and get the heck out of there. I've heard some first-hand accounts from several of my friends from the kitchen where, oddly enough, I began and ended my employment. Anyway, we had a cook who pretty consistently came in hungover for the Saturday morning shift. This was a problem in and of itself, and it still does happen to several of our early morning cooks. Chucky will put the large mixing bowl for eggs or whatever on the large stainless steel counter and go back into the walk-in cooler to get whatever was necessary as far as ingredients that he needed. He would come back out and the bowl would be spinning down the counter. Several other cooks have told me about how they'll be prepping stuff for lunch and dinner and various items for meals throughout the week. We have a large rack that holds all of our chafing dishes, lids, and on the sides we hang all of our ladles. Well, one by one, the ladles come off as if flicked by somebody. One of the cooks, who I love dearly, gave me this advice. Should I encounter the spirit myself, I often worked early in the weekends, just put a cup of regular coffee out in the serving area and it will stop. Apparently, there was a little old man who would throw things until the early morning cook or server would get him his coffee. It's a good thing to know that there are things you can do to quell odd goings-ons. Next story. Well, I work for a city hospital in New York as an LPN. I have just about as many ghostly patients as I do living. I think my favorite two are the Walker and the Watcher. These are nicknames I gave them. The Walker is a woman who comes down the hall nightly. She's pushing or pulling an IV pole because I can hear the wheel squeak as she makes her way down the hall. This usually happens when I'm alone, go figure. If I look right at her, I can't see her, but if I look with a corner of my eye, I can just make her out. She's wearing a house gown, not a hospital gown. Now, just in front of the nurse's station is a large pillar. My ghostly visitor walks to the pillar and disappears behind it. My other ghostly client is the Watcher. This one is a middle-aged gentleman. He looks Hispanic and has a small mustache. He is dressed in a hospital gown, and I usually see him in room 2, but only if it's unoccupied. This room is located right next to the nurse's station. Most of the time, he just stands by the doorway watching the nurses. Some of my co-workers have seen him and are scared, but I tell them he can't hurt them. Somehow, I'm the only one that thinks this is funny. Next story. The first place I worked as an aide had been the county poorhouse, so it had a couple of 100 years of living and dying happening there. The old home is now the Historical Society and is open to the public. There is one building that has the name of the asylum. Our county disaster services agency has stuff stored there, and I belong to that unit. I hated going in there anywhere near dark because you could feel the confusion, hate, anger, and even in the light, you can see shadows of things that aren't there. The new home was built and we all moved just down the road back in 1976. I started working there as an aide when I turned 18, and even though I've left there several times, I still work there as a restorative RN. When I first worked there, there was an LPM, grandfather from an aide, yes, they did do that not so long ago, that had the best stories. Some of the things she said would curl your hair, but I always thought they were just that, stories. Boy, was I wrong. Even though the home was newly built and on farmland, all the residents and I probably thought some of the energy moved with them. The weirdest things happened. One night, I was working on one section, and one of our residents died. A friend and I were cleaning him up to prepare him for the funeral home, and the light above the sink started turning itself off and on. Not only did the light turn off and on, but the switch moved. Man, did I get out of that room as fast as I could. Another night, I was on the other end, and we had 3 gentlemen in the ward that had lost their legs and minds to untreated syphilis. Now note, I said their minds were lost. A few rooms down, a woman that we were expecting to die did so. At the very last minute, one of the men in the ward sat up, started talking perfect sense, asking some questions, and went back to sleep. Also, the couple across the hall had a clock radio that the alarm no longer worked in, but they always still listened to the radio. That same time, that alarm went off and stayed on till we went to check Olive and found that she had passed. Those were the mild stories. I don't know if I wasn't just as sensitive or if they ignored me, but around me a lot of that stayed mild. My grandmother lived in one of the old mansion homes in the area. She could also tell you tales that would curl your hair, but I always took it with a grain of salt. But I have to admit, you sensed a lot just being in the home. I went to work there as an RN charge nurse just before they built a new home on the same ground, and when it was done, they tore down the old mansion home. Well, believe me, those energies moved into the new building quicker than we could. Call lights turning off and on, lights, even keys locking themselves in locked rooms. The new home was equipped with surveillance cameras, and that's how we found the keys. Needless to say, I started believing my grandmother's stories. There was a man in the old home that died before I worked there, and after my grandmother died, so I'd never seen or heard of him before. I would see him every night, walking down the hall from his room, and when he'd crossed the threshold to the dining room, would step very high as if there were a large step there. It was driving me nuts, so I finally asked some of the aides that had been there a long time and described them to them, and they said, "Oh, that's just Flicky. He always did that." I sometimes believe they stay there because they had no others in their lives. Most of them came from the state hospital that had closed, and the staff was really their only family. There were several of them that I could see a lot doing just as they had done in life, looking and acting in the same manner. Was it just the energy, or were we the only ones that were there for them in life? So they stayed in death. Next story. I've worked in several nursing homes since 1997, so I've had plenty of run-ins with restless spirits. At this one nursing home, there were 3 different wings, north, east, and west. West wing was the heavy hall, mostly tube feeders and total care. East was the Medicare short-term rehab wing. Then there was north. North had a pretty eclectic mix of patients of differing levels of acuity. There was a short hall and a long hall. However, to the back of North Wing, there was a long hall that had about 10 private rooms, a day room on one end and a small dining room on the other end. The residents back on this hall, called 400 Hall, were all ambulatory and even a few wanderers. Now, I generally worked from 3 to 11, but on this particular night, the 11 to 7 girl was sick, so I was asked to stay. As I was off the next night, I agreed. Since I was working a double, I was given the assignment in 400 Hall. It was an easy assignment as most of the residents were content, and the few that weren't were really lightweight. Anyhow, I was sitting in the dining room with the lights off, charting by the dim hall lights when I caught something out of the corner of my eye moving down the hall. Thinking it was one of my wanderers, I looked up, and saw what to this day I still believe was a toddler on a tricycle. Let me tell you now, I lost it. The ADL book went flying, and I skittered up the short hallway to the nurse's station. I relayed my story to the charge nurse, and she just sort of chuckled at my expression and explained that one of the residents that had passed away years ago had a grandson that was killed by the back tires of her car. He was in the driveway, and she didn't see him and backed right over him. The night the lady died, she was calling out, "Tyler, oh my baby Tyler, Nana's coming." Then she passed. Everyone has come to the conclusion that the toddler on the tricycle still haunts the hall looking for his grandma. Either way, I never worked another 11 to 7 on 400 Hall.